So right now we say the word no when we want to tell Dagny no. No is the 51st most commonly used word in the English language. Your daughters are too old for this, but there's a UCLA study that shows children age of 4 hear the word no over 400 times a day. So dogs have something called learned irrelevance. If a word is used enough for them and it's not for them, they just filter it out. Probably like you, there's probably certain times they ask for mom where you filter that out, where there's other times if they get injured, you can, as a mom, you have that superpower, you know the difference. So if the first thing I do is I make a hissing sound like a cat instead of saying the word no. I do that for 2 reasons. Number one, she knows it's for her. Don't hiss at Sage, it definitely doesn't work on husbands, might work on kids. But my hiss is my way of saying no, don't do that, or most importantly, don't even think about doing that. Now, I have 10 versions of the hiss. I have a level 1 hiss, which is like a tss, and a level 10, which is more like, here, let me Dagny. Now, I just went to 2. That was better. So you can see how she backed up? Now, the timing of your delivery is everything. If you're too late, it's not going to really work very well. So I have 10 versions of my hiss. I only hiss once per incident. If I go hiss, 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 it waters down my authority. There's a treat there she really wants, but just because it's on the floor doesn't mean she can have it. This helps her, it would develop some impulse control. So the first thing I do is I hiss 1 time per incident. If that doesn't work, the second thing I do is I stand up. She started taking a step forward. As soon as I stood up, she stopped. Now my authority goes whichever direction my hips and shoulders are pointing. So if she's there, I'm facing her. If she walks over to the right and I stay facing here and she's over there, she literally walked away from my authority. So as she goes, I pivot to keep her in front. Now, try not to go like this, a bunch of little steps with your feet. That creates, oh, this is a game. Then she's gonna show you that she's a better athlete than we are. Wait, when you turn stationary, wait for the dog, or when you turn sideways to follow the dog, wait for the dog to be stationary. This is the following through part. If she's walking away, and then I sit down in the middle of her walking away, she's gonna be like, I read that wrong. Half of dog communication is through movement, the other half of the time they're just meandering around. So when you stand up, I call it jacking the boxing up. I bounce up quickly and snap to face them. Wait for her to turn, or wait for her, to be stationary. She can stand, she can sit, or she can lie down. As soon as she does any of the 3 of those things, then I can sit back down. Now when I sit down, I lose some authority. So if you're trying to follow through, wait for her to do that before you sit back down. Now the third consequence is kind of what we were going over last night when you were working on some dinner and she kept on coming near you. So the third consequence is I stand up abruptly and I march directly at the dog, taking territory. Giving and taking territory is a huge part of dog communication. So what I do when I do that is, let's say I'm the dog and you're walking at me and I'm backing up like this, but I'm still facing you. I'm still challenging because I'm orientated facing you. So when I want to say, I understand, I'm going to do this as a dog. I'm going to turn sideways or greater. As soon as she turns sideways, we stop marching at her. Now we're not stomping at her, we're just moving briskly directly at her. You want to give her like a flinching experience. Like if you're in a hallway and you look up and somebody's there and you flinch back. So don't stop short. A lot of people, like if this is the dog, they're like, well, the dog's like, I don't have to move because they stop themselves. She's a big dog, so if you bump into her, that's fine. She needs to understand if I'm still there when the human gets there, the human's running me over. Now just like the second consequence, we wait for her to be stationary. Now if she turns sideways and she's stationary, that's good enough. But if she turns sideways and then walks around and walks over the bed, she's walking around in circles in the bed, wait for her to sit, then you can go back to what you're doing. Now if she keeps on coming back over and over again, then when you walk away, instead of turning away because your authority goes away, I walk away backwards, I take a step and I pause and I read the dog. If it stays stationary, take another step backwards, pause and read the dog. If the dog sits or lies down, then I can kind of turn sideways and go back to what I was doing. Sitting and laying down are more subordinate positions. That's kind of the dog's way of saying, I got you. So that's the third consequence. The fourth consequence, this is like your atom bomb, which you probably aren't going to have to use very much with her. She seems a pretty amicable dog, not super high energy. But what I do is basically give the dog a timeout. I grab a leash, I put the dog on a leash, and I step on the leash. I give the dog just enough room to stand or sit. That's it. When she's in a doggy timeout, nobody can pet her, look at her, talk to her, play with her, nada. It's like she's invisible. Now, some dogs will flop around and throw a temper tantrum. So, Mom, you're familiar with this. If she does that, I ignore her. I don't say a word. Usually, a minute later, they stop, and then they will sit down, but they'll sit as far away from you, the leash, as they can. And so it'd be a tense leash. So if this is the foot that's on leash and the dog is sitting here, I take the leash as soon as she sits down and I slide it towards the dog to take the tension off of the leash. A dog will always pull against a tense leash. Now when I do that, usually like a minute later, they will lay down. Sometimes it's several minutes later. When she lays down, if this crack right here represents the leash, when she lays down, I just move my foot off very subtly like that. I don't tell the dog good job, I don't pet it, and I don't take it off the leash. If I do any three of those things, the dog's like, oh, I can go back to what I was doing. So once I take it off of, I've taken my foot off the leash, she's gonna eventually, sometimes she'll sit there for a minute. We don't tell her to go, but eventually she gets up and she walks away. She's gonna be dragging the leash. Now she shouldn't drag the leash unsupervised because she could get it caught and injure herself. If a couple minutes later she ramps back up and starts doing the thing again, she walks by, you can step on the leash or pick up the leash and correct her. But if a couple minutes later she stays calm and she's fine, then we take the leash off. It's not a quid pro quo. So these are the escalating consequences that I've developed. That they really are mirroring things that dogs do amongst themselves. So they typically respond to it right away. I mean, normally you put 3 treats on the floor like here, she's not going to sit and lay down several feet away like she is now, correct?
Right.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is hiss. Second thing we do is stand up abruptly, turn to face her. Third thing we do is stand up, or if we're already standing, we just march towards her until she turns sideways. And the fourth thing, and also she has to be stationary before we're done. And then the fourth one is the leash timeout. Now let's say that you're eating dinner. For dogs, to be within 7 feet of anyone who's eating is very rude. That's how they challenge. Even if they're not begging, they're just laying on the floor and not even looking at you, the proximity is still inappropriate. So when your guys are eating dinner, whoever's closest and can see her, if she starts walking towards, hiss. And sometimes you do 2 things at once. Like when I first started doing this, when I dropped the treats, I hissed and stood up simultaneously. You can combine them, but the goal is to always start with your hiss. Eventually, at first it's gonna be hiss, stand up, march, leash. Then it'll be hiss, stand up, march, then hiss, stand up, and eventually it's just hiss. I can get my Dalmatian Farley to drop a live squirrel out of his mouth just by hissing at him. But he knows if he doesn't, I'm gonna follow through, so he gives me what I want. But like I showed you last night with the kitchen, if you're preparing food and she's like pacing back and forth, she's not just like saying, oh, I'm just happen to be here. She's trying to challenge you that you'll go away and I can snag something on the counter, or if you drop something. So if you drop something on the floor and you want her to come pick it up, you're making the decision for her, but she can't do it on her own. So the escalating consequences, if you're in the kitchen and you're establishing a boundary, she backs up and turns sideways, but she's still in the immediate area, you keep marching at her because she hasn't given you what you wanted. But as soon as she crosses the boundary, we stop and then wait for her to be stationary, then go back to what you're doing. Okay. So the petting with a purpose is using the positive. This is how we use the negative and disagree with the dog. But again, make sure you do it with good timing. If you can catch a dog right before they start doing it, or immediately as soon as they start, the hiss will be enough. Once they get into it, you might have to hiss and stand up and march away.